Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. So I am out doing some bird photography this morning with this lovely little gem, the Nikon ZF. I picked it up last month with the intention of making it my main backup to the Z9, and I really want to put it through its paces and see how it does with birds and with wildlife. So I'm going to give it a shot, see how it does, and I'll give you my impressions in my review. Now, earlier this morning, I did some controlled autofocus tests in my blind, so I'll put those on now so you can see how it did, and we'll jump back here to the field where I will be out and about looking for some birds, so let's get to it. I spent a few hours in the blind testing my ZF, and I found that overall it did a respectable job with both wide area autofocus and 3D tracking. The camera is definitely a major improvement over the ZF-C and the Z6 II that I was used to. If I had to note a few observations though, one would be that occasionally with the 3D tracking, I noted that the camera would sometimes hunt for the subject in situations where the Z9 normally just doesn't for me. Sometimes there were obvious branches that seemed to be confusing the autofocus system that I could say are the probable culprit, but other times I have no idea why it was hunting. The other small observation I made is kind of hard to capture on video, but it's that the ZF sometimes is slower to find the eye than the Z9. It seems to usually get there eventually, but it's just not as instantaneous to me as I'm used to with the Z9. Alright, so let's jump back to the field and take some photos. By the way, I kept running out of daylight and getting rained out this week, so I'll be jumping to multiple locations in this video. On to the next one. Okay, so I've had the ZF for a few months now, and what I've found is that I'm reaching for it more and more over my Z9 when it comes to family photography and when it comes to just everyday, carry my camera around photography. And I like that, but I haven't found myself reaching for it over the Z9 yet for wildlife photography, and I don't think I will. And I think that's because the Z9's got a higher 45 megapixel sensor for cropping, it's got better autofocus capabilities, the bird subject detection, for example, and it also has a lack of shutter blackout. So I think it's going to remain my primary body. But what I want to see today is whether or not the ZF will make me feel good for using it as a suitable replacement for my Z6 II. Is it an improvement? Can I use it as a backup body? So that's what I'm hoping to find out, and I'll let you know what I think. Ran out of daylight again, on to location 3. Okay, so I just got my first real action shot with the ZF. There was a belted kingfisher just a few feet away, and we startled it. It took off flying, and I was able to try to get some shots of it in midair from pretty far away with the 3D tracking on, and the ZF actually did a respectable job. So if I got any of those in focus, which I think I did, I'll put them on for you right now. Okay, so I messed up the shot. The shutter speed was way too low, but the kingfisher was in focus, so I'm still giving the point to the ZF for nailing the focus on a difficult shot. Alright, so I need to conclude this video with my thoughts, and I've been testing the ZF all week in different lighting conditions, different weather conditions, you name it. And I've come up with some cons, I have a few pros, and I'm going to give you my recommendation on whether or not I'll be using this for birds and wildlife, and finally who I think this camera might be for. So let's start with the cons. The big glaring one, in my opinion, is the sensor. It's a 24 megapixel sensor. It takes a lovely image. It renders this beautiful image, but I mostly like it for portraits, for people, and for video. I just think for really small birds, it is very hard to get close enough to fill the frame, and you just don't have a lot of megapixel real estate to crop. And so where I felt I was missing this camera the most really was in situations where with my Z9 with the 45 megapixel sensor, I would crop in and use DX crop. And I wasn't able to do that out here, and I felt like I would have just really liked that option. The second big con that I thought was going to be a pro to me is actually the 3D tracking. It's good, don't get me wrong, and it is leaps and bounds above the Z6 II. So if you're comparing the Z6 II or the Z7 II to the ZF, or even the ZFC, the Z50 or the Z30 to the ZF is definitely an improvement. But where I felt like I was lacking a little bit was in the consistency of the autofocus compared to the Z9. And so I think I'm being unfair by comparing it to the Z9, but I can't not compare it to the Z9 because I have the Z9. So I think I'm a little biased. So I'm obviously going to reach for that one first. But if the Z9 didn't exist, the Z8 didn't exist, and I was looking at the Z series mirrorless lineup, I do think the ZF has the best autofocus out there. But yeah, I think I'm still going to be reaching for my Z9. Now, I do think the autofocus is good enough to use. I just happen to have my opinion tainted by the fact that it was hunting a lot more than I would have liked, especially compared to my Z8 or Z9, and I just can't experience the improved Z8 or Z9. But if you're shopping for a camera or you're trying to upgrade from a Z6 II or a Z7 II to the ZF, it will definitely be an autofocus improvement. It's just not quite as consistent as the top tier bodies, so I would definitely put it somewhere in between. In terms of pros, the camera has the best in-body stabilization that Nikon has ever put into a camera, and I definitely found that to be helpful, especially in lower light situations. So whereas with the Z8 or the Z9, they've got pretty good image stabilization, but I just wanted to kind of reach for the ZF a little bit more as it was getting close to dark, and I was still able to get a pretty good and not as noisy image. So that is a plus for the ZF. So will I be using this camera for birds and wildlife going forward? Not really. I think as a backup body, definitely. It's good enough for me to bring with me, use for video, and then if something happens and my Z9 battery dies or I've, forgotten a memory card or something, the ZF will be a suitable backup. I also could see myself maybe sticking the 300 PF on it and using it for mammals maybe slower moving subjects that might fill the frame. But for birds, I primarily am just going to always stick to the Z9, I think. So who do I think this camera might be for? I think somebody would be better suited to buy this camera, not for birds or wildlife, but for family photography, street photography, videography, and I think that is probably where it's going to fit into my lineup as well. I am glad I have it. I think it's a better camera than the Z6 II, and it's a better camera than the ZFC. It's probably the perfect combination camera that fits most of my needs except birds and wildlife, but it's good enough as a backup. So I think that's probably what I'll be using it for, and I think anybody that is going to be using it for those purposes will be really happy with it. If you're looking for a good wildlife camera though, I would consider maybe saving up for the Z8 or waiting to see what the Z6 III looks like. If it's got a higher megapixel sensor, you might be better off with that. And I would even maybe consider the Z7 II if you're not trying to have the most perfect autofocus, because that 45 megapixel sensor kind of would give you more real estate to crop if you needed it. And I really took a lot of great photos when I had that camera as well. So those are my thoughts, and I'd love to hear yours. So let me know down in the comments below, and thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.